Let me tell you something about a specific kind of wound, not the kind that announces itself, not the kind that has a clear origin story that fits neatly into the narrative of what trauma is supposed to look like, not the kind that gets acknowledged at family dinners or validated by the people who were supposed to provide what was missing, the kind that hides inside the personality, inside the coping strategies that became so automatic they stopped feeling like coping strategies and started feeling like just who you are. Inside the relationships that keep following the same patterns no matter how much you understand them. Inside the persistent low-level sense that something fundamental was never quite given to you that most people around you seem to have received without effort or awareness. The wound of inadequate parenting is one of the most prevalent and least openly discussed sources of adult psychological difficulty in the clinical literature. Not because it is rare, because it is so common that it has become the baseline. Because the people carrying it often have no frame of reference for what was missing. Because the parents who failed to provide it were often themselves failed by their parents. And because the culture has not yet developed adequate language for the difference between parents who were present and parents who were genuinely available. That difference is what this is about. Let's start with what adequate parenting actually means in developmental psychology terms. Because this is the foundational piece and the one that most people who were inadequately parented have never been given clearly. The developmental psychology research on what children actually need from caregiving environments, drawing on Bowlby's foundational attachment theory, on Diana Baumrinn's research on parenting styles, on the subsequent decades of developmental research that built on both, identifies a specific set of conditions that adequate parenting provides. Not perfection. The research is explicit on this. Donald Winnicott's concept of the good enough parent, the parent who is not perfect but who is sufficiently responsive, sufficiently present, sufficiently attuned to the child's genuine needs, is the developmental standard. Not flawless care, adequate care. What adequate care provides is specific, consistent emotional availability. The parent who is not just physically present but genuinely accessible, whose attention and warmth are reliably there when the child needs them. Attunement, the parent who notices and responds to the child's actual emotional state rather than the state that is convenient or comfortable for the parent. Repair, the parent who, when they inevitably misattune or fail, notices and comes back, who demonstrates that ruptures in connection are temporary and repairable. And autonomy support, the parent who allows the child to develop a genuine self rather than requiring the child to become what the parent needs them to be. When these conditions are consistently absent, not occasionally, not imperfectly, but consistently, the developing child does not simply experience a deficit. They adapt, and the adaptations they build to survive inadequate parenting become the psychological structures they carry into adult life. The most important finding in the research on inadequate parenting and adult psychology is not about what was done to the child. It is about what the child did in response. Adaptation, creative, intelligent, necessary adaptation to conditions that were not adequate for their actual developmental needs. The child who could not rely on a consistently available caregiver learned to self-regulate without the co-regulation that attachment theory identifies as the developmental foundation of self-regulation capacity. They became necessarily precociously self-sufficient, independent in ways that looked like maturity and were actually a response to the unavailability of the person who was supposed to be there. The child whose emotional states were consistently misattuned to, whose sadness was dismissed, whose anger was punished, whose joy was ignored or inconvenient, learned to manage their emotional expression in ways that minimized the negative responses those expressions generated. They became good at containing, at presenting the emotional state that was safe rather than the one that was real. The child who was required, implicitly or explicitly, to meet the parent's emotional needs, to be the parent's confidant, their emotional support, their source of validation, learned to orient toward other people's emotional states at the expense of their own. They became extraordinarily attuned to what other people needed, and extraordinarily disconnected from what they themselves needed. These adaptations were not failures. They were solutions. Intelligent, necessary, creative solutions to the specific conditions of inadequate parenting. The problem is not that they were developed. The problem is that they do not stop running when the conditions that produce them no longer apply. The research on adult attachment, The extension of Bowlby's foundational work into adult romantic and interpersonal relationships by Hazen, Shaver, and the subsequent literature is the most directly applicable body of research for understanding what inadequate parenting does to adult psychology. The attachment patterns formed in response to the specific inadequacies of the early caregiving environment do not disappear with adulthood. They transfer. They become the template through which adult relationships are experienced, interpreted, and navigated. The child who adapted to an inconsistently available caregiver, whose attachment figure was sometimes warm and sometimes withdrawn, sometimes present and sometimes absent, develops what attachment researchers call an anxious attachment style. In adult relationships, this manifests as a hypervigilance to signs of abandonment, a nervous system that is constantly monitoring for the withdrawal that experience has taught it to expect, an intensity of need for reassurance that partners find overwhelming, and a relationship with intimacy that is simultaneously desperately desired and deeply feared. The child who adapted to a consistently unavailable or rejecting caregiver, whose attachment needs were met with distance, with dismissal, with the implicit message that needing was unacceptable, develops an avoidant attachment style. In adult relationships, this manifests as a compulsive self-sufficiency, a discomfort with genuine intimacy, a nervous system that interprets closeness as threat, and a relationship with vulnerability that is so defended against that genuine connection becomes structurally difficult. And the child who adapted to a caregiving environment that was frightening, where the attachment figure was simultaneously the source of safety and the source of threat, develops what researchers call disorganized attachment, the most complex and most clinically significant pattern, where the strategies for managing the attachment system are themselves contradictory, where closeness and distance are both simultaneously desired and feared, where the internal working model of relationships contains fundamental contradictions that produce confusing and painful relational patterns in adulthood. None of these patterns are character flaws. They are the adult expressions of adaptive strategies that were entirely appropriate to the environments that produced them. Let me talk about something the research identifies as one of the most significant and least visible consequences of inadequate parenting: the development of what psychologists call a false self. Donald Winnicott's concept of the false self, developed through decades of clinical work with individuals whose early caregiving environments required them to adapt their genuine selfhood to meet the needs of the caregiver, describes a specific psychological structure that the inadequately parented child often builds as a survival mechanism. The false self is the version of the self that learned what was acceptable, what was safe, what generated the positive responses and avoided the negative ones in the specific caregiving environment. It is not dishonest exactly. It is adaptive. It is the self that the child learned to present because the genuine self, with its actual needs, its actual emotional states, its actual preferences and responses, was not consistently received in ways that felt safe. The adult who was never parented properly often has an extraordinarily well-developed false self and a genuine self that is uncertain, underdeveloped, and difficult to access. They know how to present. They know how to manage impressions. They know how to be what different environments require. What they often do not know, or know only vaguely, only in private moments, only in the gap between performances, is who they actually are. What they actually want, what they actually feel when they are not monitoring the response their feelings will generate. This is one of the most painful aspects of the inadequately parented adult experience, and one of the least visible to the people around them. Because the false self is often extraordinarily convincing, often genuinely impressive, often mistaken, even by the person themselves, for the real thing. Here is the finding that I think is most important for the specific audience this topic reaches. The research on what is called complex developmental trauma, the psychological impact of chronic, relational, early-onset adverse experience as distinct from single-incident trauma, identifies a constellation of adult presentations that are consistently underdiagnosed and consistently misattributed. Bessel van der Kolk's foundational work and the subsequent clinical literature on complex trauma, on what has been called developmental trauma disorder, on the specific presentations that chronic inadequate caregiving produces, document something that the clinical world is only slowly fully integrating. The adult who is never parented properly does not always present with obvious symptoms. They do not always arrive in a therapist's office pointing to the origin of their difficulty. They often present with chronic low-level depression that does not respond to standard treatment, with relationship patterns they cannot stop repeating despite genuine desire to change them, with a pervasive sense of emptiness or unreality that they cannot account for, with difficulty knowing what they want, what they feel, what they value, a fundamental uncertainty about the self that the false self has been papering over for decades. They present with hypervigilance that reads as anxiety, with emotional numbing that reads as depression, with the compulsive caretaking of others that reads as generosity but is actually the adult expression of the child who learned that taking care of others was the only safe way to have a place in a relationship. And they present with the specific and devastating conviction that whatever is wrong is something wrong with them, not something that was done to them, not something that happened in an environment they did not choose and could not control, something fundamentally, irreparably wrong with who they are. That conviction is not a finding of accurate self-assessment. It is the internalized verdict of an inadequate parenting environment, delivered without words, absorbed without resistance because there was no developmental stage at which the child had the resources to resist it. Let me talk about the body, because this is the piece that the purely psychological framing of inadequate parenting consistently misses. Van der Kolk's work, and the subsequent somatic research on developmental trauma, is explicit on something that the talk therapy model of trauma treatment has historically underemphasized. The adaptations to inadequate parenting are not only psychological, they are physiological. They are encoded in the nervous system, in the body's baseline level of arousal, in the physical patterns of tension, of constriction, of the chronic low-level activation of a threat response system that learned, very early, that the environment required constant monitoring. Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory, and its application to the understanding of developmental trauma, describes the specific ways that chronic early relational stress shapes the autonomic nervous system's baseline functioning. The person who grew up in a caregiving environment that was inconsistently safe, that required chronic vigilance, that did not provide the co-regulation that the developing nervous system needs, has a nervous system that learned to run at a higher baseline activation than one that developed in a consistently safe environment. This is not metaphor. This is measurable physiology. And it has consequences for the adult that are not simply psychological, for how they experience their own body, for their relationship with physical states of relaxation and safety, which can feel unfamiliar, even threatening, to a nervous system that learned that dropping its guard was dangerous. For the chronic physical symptoms, the tension, the digestive disruption, the sleep difficulty, that are the body's expression of a stress response system that never fully learned to come back to baseline. The adult who was never parented properly is not just carrying psychological wounds, they are carrying those wounds in their body, in the physical texture of how they inhabit their own nervous system, and healing that requires approaches that reach the body, not just the mind. Here is where I want to land, and I want to be honest about what the research supports and what it does not. The wounds of inadequate parenting are real, measurable, documented across decades of developmental, clinical, and neurobiological research. They are not a matter of sensitivity or perspective or the pathologizing of ordinary human difficulty. They are the specific, identifiable consequences of specific deficits in the early caregiving environment that the research has mapped with considerable precision. And they are not destiny. The research on neuroplasticity, on the brain's capacity for structural and functional change across the lifespan, and the clinical research on the treatment of developmental trauma are both clear on this point. The patterns laid down in early caregiving environments are not fixed. They are deeply ingrained. They are automatic in ways that make them feel unchangeable. They are running below the threshold of conscious choice in ways that make deliberate effort insufficient on its own, but they are not permanent. The research on what actually produces change in adults carrying the wounds of inadequate parenting is specific. Relational experiences that provide what the early environment did not. Genuine attunement, consistent availability, the experience of rupture and genuine repair. whether in therapeutic relationships or in genuinely healthy adult relationships. Somatic approaches that reach the nervous system rather than just the cognitive understanding. The development of the capacity for self-compassion, which the research on self-compassion by Kristen Neff identifies as one of the strongest predictors of recovery from shame-based developmental wounds, and something simpler than any of those, but not easy. The recognition that what you have been carrying is not evidence of who you are. It is evidence of what you adapted to, and adaptations, unlike character, can change.